Nomadic societies adapted into their environment, although they were located in Central Asia where it usually doesn't rain. With no form of water and no large rivers, nomadic people couldn't support their agricultural production. The only type of agricultural resources they had was grass and shrubs, which animals thrived on, like sheep. The animals were used to make a shelter known as yurts, and they also created an alcoholic drink named kumis. Nomadic societies created two classes, which were nobles and commoners. The nobles did very little governing in their communities since they had clans to do it for them, but they actually acted noble when it came to times of war. The commoners on the other side were usually those fighting in war. Many Turkish people focused their religious beliefs in shamans, which were specialists who had supernatural powers and could talk and build connection with gods. Over time, the Turkish transitioned their religious beliefs to Islam. Turkish people lived on the borders of the Abbasid realm, which created opportunities for trade. This led the Seljuk Turks moving into the Abbasid realms and combining together as one. The Seljuk leader was known as Tughril Beg, who was known to the Seljuk as Sultan. Tughril expanded his rule to Baghdad, Syria, and Palestine. The Seljuks started moving into Anatolia during the 11th century. In 1071, the Seljuk forces were defeated by the Byzantine army in Manzikert, located in eastern Anatolia, but managed to capture the Byzantine emperor. By 1453, Ottoman Turks captured the Byzantine capital at Constantinople, and Byzantine and Christian Anatolia had become a Turkish and Islamic land. Mahmud Ghazni disliked Buddhism and Hinduism and launched raids to temples, shrines, and monasteries. And by the 13th century, the impact of nomadic people had reached unprecedented levels in Eurasian history.
The Mongol Empire emerged in the steppe lands of eastern Central Asia. Just like every other nomadic group, their only form of social and political organization were kinship groups composed of families, clans, and tribes, which as a result made it impossible for them to create a large-scale empire. But soon this impossibility became possible when Genghis Khan rose to power. Genghis Khan, also known as Temujin, was born in 1167 into a noble family, living under the shadow of his warrior father who he aspired to be. All dreams were soon crushed when rivals poisoned his father and sought to undermine the power of his clan by capturing him. Instead of allowing these negative experiences get to him, his desire to become the world's greatest leader grew even more and came true when he established the Mongol Empire. He rose to power when he had mastered the art of steppe diplomacy, which was the ability to dominate the world of the steppe lands by being loyal to allies, having the willingness to kill superiors in order to enhance social status, and establish cooperative relations with outsiders. He legitimized his power through the Conference of 1206, in which a group of Mongol leaders joined together to recognize Genghis Khan as a universal ruler. To further spread Mongolian influence, he established the Mongolian capital of Karakoram to emphasize the superiority Mongols had over any other tribe or clan. To further consolidate the power, Mongols conquered Central Asian societies, which included Tibet, northern China, Persia, and obviously Central Asia. Starting with northern China, the Mongols destroyed the Churchan Empire by capturing the Churchan capital and establishing their own, known as Kambalik. They went on conquering Persia, which was ruled by the Seljuk ruler known as Khwarazm Shah. Genghis Khan sought to open trade and diplomatic relations with the ruler, but the Shah disliked the Mongols and wanted to murder Genghis. For this reason, he sought revenge and killed him and his army, controlling the entire Persian realm. To prevent the possibility of another Shah, he made sure that the territory remained in shambles by destroying cities in the Qanat irrigation system, which sustained agricultural productivity in that region. At the time of his death in 1227, Genghis Khan had not established a central government that unified the entire Mongolian realm. His only form of administration was through overlords that supervised local administrators and extracted tributes from these lands. But his future successors would achieve this goal of a central government that would bring prosperity to the empire. After the death of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire was separated into 4 parts, one being the Khatanate of the Great Khan, which was the peak of Mongolian power and was located in eastern Asia. The Khan that led this territory was Kublai Khan, who was the most successful conqueror out of all the others. He demonstrated great military power, openness to different religions, and the care of his subjects. During his time, he led the Song dynasty to its collapse in 1276 and established his own dynasty known as the Yuan dynasty in 1279. He made several attempts in conquering southeastern Asian territories, but although they were successful in doing so, they did not adapt well to the tropical climate, which was inadequate for their horses. He also sought to conquer Japan through seaborne invasions, but all failed due to the kamikaze, which were divine winds. The other parts included the Khanate of Chagatai, located in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate of Persia in Southwest Asia. The Ilkhanate of Persia emerged when Hulagu, Kubilai's brother, captured Baghdad and led the Abbasid Empire to its collapse. The Mongols conquered these territories. They began to realize that their military tactics were not enough to control those populations, and as a result, they began developing administrative systems that even caused change in the Mongolian culture. In Persia, although the Mongols took on the high administrative positions, they made sure to allow Persians to administrate at a local level as long as they delivered taxes and did their job of maintaining order. To prevent the possibility of conflicts between the religious people, the Mongols tolerated all religions, holding each of them at an equal social standard. But these privileges soon vanished when Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam, forcing everyone to do the same, and in the process of doing so, large-scale massacres were set towards Christians and Jews. This change indicated the beginning of Mongols absorbing themselves into Muslim Persian society. In China, the situation for Chinese natives was harsher than that of Persians because the Mongols isolated them from society by outlawing them from learning the Mongol language and even prevented them from intermarriage. They suppressed Chinese cultural traditions by abolishing the Confucian educational and examination system, but their form of administration was through the help of foreigners such as Arabs, Persians, and even Europeans, for example, Marco Polo. To further enhance administration and unity among the people, they tolerated all religions. A cultural change that occurred was the blend of the shamanism religion, which was native to Mongols, and Buddhism. This religion often recognized Mongols as legitimate rulers and incarnations of Buddha himself, and oftentimes served as a center for Mongols to practice shamanism.
And Eurasian integration. The Mongols encouraged travel and communication over long distances between Eurasian land through things such as the courier system, which overall promoted trade, missionaries, diplomatic travel, and the movement of people. The Mongols and trade. The Mongols worked to secure trade routes and the safety of merchants. The Khans often fought amongst themselves, however, maintained order within the realms to keep trade stimulated. Long-distance trade now became less risky because of the protection of the Mongol Empire, lands like China and Europe being linked for the first time because of these efforts. Diplomatic missions. The Great Khans maintained close communication through diplomatic embassies. Khans would send envoys to other lands to establish relations or allyships with other lands and vice versa. Missionary efforts. Missionaries took the opportunity of the safer roads to expand on religion. This resulted in a rise of Muslim Turkish. Lamist Buddhism had become popular among Mongols. Nestorian Christians and Roman Catholics were introduced to China as well. Resettlement. As the Mongol Empire grew, there came a need for specialized talents such as art, so the Mongols would take people from captured territories or be offered some from the allies, like the Uyghur Turks, and move them to Karakorum. The decline of the Mongols in Persia and China. The collapse of the Ilkhanate was caused by excessive spending that strained the treasury, along with exploited peasants that led to reduced revenue. To solve this, the Ilkhan tried to implement paper money to gather precious metals. However, this didn't work. The Ilkhan had eventually reversed its order because of how much people just didn't see the value in the paper money. And then when the Ilkhan Ghazan died in 1304 without an heir, this ended the Ilkhanate, and Persia went on to go form governments. The decline of the Yun dynasty. Like Persia, the Mongols used paper money, which was already used in China. However, they did not provide adequate reserves of the bullion, which caused a loss of confidence in the money and for prices to raise up. This led to tensions between the citizens and the Mongols, and enemies saw this as an opportunity to attack because the Yun dynasty was a very powerful land. The bubonic plague. Due to the Mongols' expansive and active trade routes, the epidemics, like the bubonic plague, or commonly known as the Black Death, spread easily through Europe and Asia. The plague killed half or more of the exposed population, and the depopulation had weakened the Mongol Empire further. The surviving Mongol Khanates. The Khanate in Chiang Hai continued in Central Asia and had been a continuous threat against the northwestern borders of China until the 1700s. The Khanate of the Golden Horde continued in Caucasus and the steppe lands until the mid-16th century, and the Mongols that lived in the Crimean Peninsula lived there until Joseph Stalin forcibly removed them to other parts of the USSR.
The Mongol collapse opened up China and Persia.
Hey, why is he limping?
Oh, that's just Tamer the Lame.
Wait, we should call him Tamerlane.
Tamerlane is a self-made Turkish conqueror, born in 1336, and his role model was Genghis Khan. In 1360, he eliminated his rivals by either defeating them or becoming allies, and in 1370 extended his authority to the Khanate of Chagatai. Conquesting two rich cities between Persia and Afghanistan enabled him to tax trade and agricultural production. Although weakening in 1390, he invaded and sacked India. While preparing to invade China and start his conquest to Southwest Asia, he got sick and died in 1405, causing his sons and grandsons to fight over his empire and dividing it into four main regions, later becoming the Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman Empire. The Mongol conquest to Persia caused a large number of nomadic Turks to migrate to the Ilkhanate and Anatolia, where they followed leaders such as Osman, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, and his followers were called the Ottomans. In 1299, he declared independence from the Seljuk Sultan, and in the 1350s expanded his authority. By the 1380s, he conquered the Balkan Peninsula and planned to capture Constantinople, but Tamerlane delayed this by crushing his army and taking the Sultan. After Tamerlane's death, the Ottomans re-established and in the 1440s recovered. Sultan Mehmed II captured Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul in 1453. Then took the rest of the Byzantine Empire and got control of Greece, North Africa, Southeast Europe, and Southwest Asia, creating the vast Ottoman Empire.
Chapter 26, Africa and the Atlantic World. The Kingdom of Ghana originated in the 5th century. Ghana was overcome by Mali by becoming the most leading strength in West Africa, but in the 15th century, Mali weakened because of Songhai dominance, so Songhai took over that title. Songhai was economically exceptional, which led to flourishing states. Songhai ruler was Sunni Ali, who brought popular trading cities like Timbuktu and Jin under his control, which led to Songhai's wealth. Gao had become the capital city which participated in large trade. The emperors of Songhai were all Muslim who supported teaching the Quran and valued Islam. Songhai dominated most of West Africa until the Moroccan army attacked Songhai, and so it fell. The fall of the Songhai led to more kingdoms to rise. Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese mariner, made the Swahili decline because he ordered his followers to decrease Swahili trade rates. The Kingdom of Congo rose in the 14th century. Portuguese fleets managed to create the connections with the Kingdom of Congo. The Portuguese developed connections with the King of Congo and provided them with help they needed. The kings of Congo wanted to expand their relationships with Portuguese, and so they converted to Christianity. King Nzinga Memba of Congo became devoted to Roman Catholicism. Congo had become a city of religion, sometimes referred as Congo of the Bell. Portuguese relations soon fell and Portuguese dominated them, leading to the creation of Angola. Portuguese began to look for slaves, which led to, in 1665, for Portuguese colonists to go into war with Congo. By the 18th century, Congo was gone. Portuguese began to expand their slave trade to Ngongo, which grew powerfully. Portuguese increased their relationships with other places due to their trade with slaves. Queen Nzinga didn't support the Portuguese. She often wore male warrior clothing and wanted to be referred as king. Queen Nzinga wanted Portuguese out, but lost because of the economic advantage the Portuguese obtained, so the Portuguese took over Angola.
Islam and Christianity in early modern Africa. Indigenous beliefs. The majority of Africans believed in one supreme God, but this shifted into believing in the living dead. The living dead were spirits that had the capability to intervene in human affairs and would reward those that lived a worthy life and punish those who didn't. Living a worthy life meant honoring one's descendants and ancestors. Islam in sub-Saharan Africa. Islam arrived through Muslim merchants from the Indian Ocean who were seeking for inland resources, which included ivory, timber, gold, and slaves. Islam was most concentrated in the commercial centers of West Africa, which participated in the trans-Saharan trade, and the Swahili city-states, which participated in the Indian Ocean trade. A syncretic blend that occurred between the two was this mixture that included beliefs in spirits and magic, but most importantly, it allowed the interaction between men and females, Women were liberated from harsh Islamic customs, but Muslims from North Africa and Arabia perceived this as a violation to the original form of Islam and used this as motivation to spread a stricter form of Islam. The Fulani were pastoral nomads from West Africa that practiced a strict form of Islam and sought to spread it throughout the region. They did this by using military campaigns that would establish Islamic states and impose this strict form of Islam while also preserving some syncretic aspects. And through schools, they were established in the countryside, which taught the Quran and spread Islam in that area. Syncretism, Christianity and indigenous. It all began with the Portuguese community in Congo, which introduced Roman Catholic Christianity to Central Africa, and the people from Central Africa would accept Christianity voluntarily and utilize it as an economic and political foundation. Syncretism. Africans formed syncretic cults, perceived Christian missionaries as magicians, wore crosses, and utilized amulets to avoid negative spirits. The Antonian movement. Dona Beatriz claimed that Saint Anthony possessed her and had chosen her to communicate his messages. These messages were ideas that Jesus was African, Congo was the Holy Land, and heaven was only meant for Africans. Despite getting executed by European king Pedro IV, Africans fought against European missionaries. This resistance perfectly demonstrates the way Africans created their own form of Christianity to satisfy their own needs and beliefs. Social change in early modern Africa. Social structure before Europeans. Kinship groups. Kinship groups were the basis of social and political organizations. Within them were clans that organized affairs and disciplined those who violated standards. Alliances with other clans would form large kinship networks. Social change brought from Europeans included the introduction of new resources such as textiles and metal goods of different styles. They also introduced trade, which also meant the introduction of new food crops such as maize, peanuts, and manioc, which thrived in the African soil. And as a result of this introduction of new food crops, the population grew and it increased by a lot with the introduction of manioc. And while this occurred, so did the large migrations of enslaved Africans, but the population continued to increase. And as a result, this growth was from 34 million in the 1500s to 44 million in the 1600s, 52 million in the 1700s, and 62 million in the 1800s.
Foundations of slave trade. Slavery in Africa was normalized after the Bantu migration spread agriculture as there was a need for cheap or free labor. African slaves usually worked as cultivators in society, however some worked as administrators, soldiers, or even advisors, which differs from the Europeans as they did not have these opportunities. Africa also differed from others as they saw power as having control over human labor rather than ownership of land. This is because they thought having more individuals to work means that the land is more productive, and often would buy slaves in order to enlarge their families and involve them into their kingships. The Islamic trade started in the 8th century when the Muslim merchants sought African slaves to sell in the Mediterranean and Asia, and would raid villages, sometimes with the help of state officials, to force people into servitude. These captured peoples would go across the Sahara to Swahili ports to then be traded or bought. By the 20th century, more than 10 million Africans left their home for servitude, which only rose due to Europe joining the slave trade in the 15th to 16th century. Human cargoes. Early in the slave trade, the Portuguese had first forcibly taken Africans as slaves in the 1400s, but were met with resistance until they found they could trade for slaves. The Portuguese began to bring slaves to their island colonies as they both lacked a population and labor for the plantations made there. Examples of these islands was cotton in Cape Verde and sugar in Sao Tome. The Spanish also used slavery as they were met with resistance from the natives in the Caribbean and Americas. The demand for labor stimulated a commerce in the Western Hemisphere called the triangular trade. Europeans carried European products such as firearms to trade in Africa for slaves and to then sell those slaves to the Caribbean or Americas to work in plantations. Then the Americans would sell products to Europe and the cycle would continue.
The Middle Passage was a transatlantic journey from Africa to the Caribbean and Americas that slaves took. Slaves were held in filthy, overcrowded quarters under ships and were treated with extreme cruelty. These conditions were so bad an estimated 1/4 of the individuals who went on this trip had died.
During the 17th century, 2,000 slaves left Africa annually. The highest point it reached was in the 18th century when 55,000 slaves left Africa. Kingdoms such as Rwanda and Buganda and herding societies such as Maasai and Turkana were able to escape slave trade because they resisted against it. While many African societies were decreasing economically, other societies flourished economically from slave trade. Some Africans who raided took other Africans and sold them to Europeans. Later on in the 19th century, when slavery was abolished, Africans began to realize how damaged African slave trade had caused them to lose economic stability. People who owned slaves preferred younger men who were between the ages 14 through 35. The preference of younger male slaves led to social implications. For example, in the 18th century, there were more women in Angola than men. Since there was more women took over the jobs and responsibilities of men. Most slaves went into plantations in tropical or subtropical areas, where the Europeans arrived in the Caribbean/Americas, where they saw a fertile island and decided to build plantations in order to gain profits. In reality, the Spanish established the first of those plantations in 1516 in Hispaniola. Most plantations produced sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. The plantations produced foods for local communities, but the purpose was to profit by exporting the crops. In order for plantations to work, slave labor became more common. One plantation had more than 100 slaves. In the Caribbean, more slaves died because of tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever, mostly because of the bad conditions slaves worked in. In Brazil, the slave conditions weren't terrible and the diseases were less common. Many slaves resisted, which sometimes led to their death. Slaves usually sabotaged the plantation and ran away. Slaves usually raided for tools, arms, and provisions. Slaves would create revolts which were more damaging for the plantations. In St. Dominguez in 1793, there was a slave revolt that caused the end of slavery as an institution. The revolt called slave owners to increase their slave execution.
The making of African American cultural traditions. So it started off when they were in slave ships and they met like other Africans from different societies. And then when they got sold, they adapted to European and American ways, creating African American traditions. So language, they like spoke Creole, which is a combination of European and African languages. And then for food, they introduced rice cultivation and also like hybrid cuisine. So one example is gumbo, which is like African okra with European style sauteed vegetables and American shellfish. And both gumbo and okra is like an African words. And religion, it was mostly Africans adopted Christianity, but not European Christianity. It was more like syncretic, so like a mix of it. So like voodoo in Haiti and stuff like that. And they associated like African deities with Christian saints and African rituals like drumming, dancing, and animal sacrifice. They also preserved the ideas of spirits and supernatural powers like magic, sorcery, witchcraft, and spirit possession. And this like influenced their life on the plantations, and they also like built houses, pots, and grass baskets in West African styles in these plantations. The end of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery. So American and French revolutionaries stimulated abolitionist movements, which caused more frequent slave revolts, and other people like fought to resist, and free slaves wrote books to expose the system. And an example of this is Olare Guano, who became free in 1766 and wrote an autobiography about his experiences as a free man and as a slave. And his book was really good, I guess, that it was a bestseller. And this allowed him to do, like, make speeches denouncing slavery. And this also strengthened the anti-slavery movement in England. So rebellions caused plantations to maintain expensive military forces.
And the more slaves they had, the more money they had to spend taking care of them. And the expansion of the Caribbean sugar production decreased the price of the sugar, but increased the price of new slaves. So lots of Europeans started to shift their investment to manufacturing industries, and because the factory wage was cheaper, so it was like, why not? And slowly they started to abolish the slave trade. Like, it started with Denmark, Britain, and the US, France, Netherlands. From 1803 to the last ship was in 1867 going to Cuba. And then after that, a few decades later, they started to abolish slavery. So Britain in 1833, in France in 1848, the US in 1865. And they ended slavery with the 1960s with Saudi Arabia and Angola.